Peter Langford vanished without a trace, but FBI Agent Mia Reyes refused to let his name fade into silence. As she unraveled the threads behind his disappearance, she uncovered a chilling pattern, one that tied missing attorneys across state lines to a secret alliance within law enforcement. What began as a single cold case exploded into a national scandal, exposing a dark conspiracy that operated beneath the shield of justice. Hollow Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, and nothing ever seemed to change. Nestled between thick woods and cornfields, it moved at a slower pace, content in its small routines and familiar faces. That's what made Peter Langford's disappearance all the more jarring. Peter wasn't just another local, he was the town's most prominent defense attorney, known for his sharp mind and soft-spoken demeanor. He had taken on cases no one else wanted, often clashing with police protocols and outdated laws. People respected him, even if they didn't always agree with him. One chilly November evening in 2018, Peter left the county courthouse just after sunset. He called his wife to say he was on his way home. He never arrived. His car was found the next morning at the entrance of Sycamore Ridge Trail, keys in the ignition, driver's door slightly ajar. The scene didn't sit right with anyone. The sheriff's office launched an immediate search. Dozens of volunteers, bloodhounds, and even aerial drones swept the area. For 3 days, the search expanded in every direction. Nothing was found, no signs of a struggle, no footprints, not even a dropped wallet. The official statement hinted at a possible accident. Maybe Peter had gone for a walk and slipped into the ravine. Maybe he got lost in the woods. But everyone who knew him found it hard to believe. Peter wasn't reckless. He didn't hike after dark, and he never left his car unlocked. When no new evidence emerged, the case quietly faded from the front page and into the archive drawer. Locals mourned and speculated, but as months passed, his name became something whispered in coffee shops or mentioned during late-night radio. The story had no ending, and that's what made it haunt people. The oddest detail was a phone ping Peter's cell had registered briefly near a cell tower over 10 miles away from where his car was found, several hours after he vanished. The data was dismissed by investigators, labeled a glitch or delayed signal, but to his wife, it was proof he had left that area alive. She begged for the case to remain open, even hired a private investigator, but doors closed quickly in Hollow Creek. The official stance was firm. No foul play, no leads, no reason to keep the case active. What few knew was that Peter had been working on a controversial motion to challenge a county ordinance related to police surveillance. It was a legal gray area that had frustrated local authorities for years. Whether that connection mattered remained a topic of quiet debate. While most people moved on, someone didn't. Mia Reyes, a visiting FBI agent and distant family friend, had been in Hollow Creek the week Peter vanished. The case stuck with her. Years later, in a different city, in a different role, she would find something that forced her to look back. Something that turned Peter Langford's disappearance from a cold case into the first clue of something much darker. 2 years after Peter Langford's disappearance, Agent Mia Reyes was assigned to a cybercrime unit based in Chicago. It was a far cry from the quiet backroads of Hollow Creek, but the memory of the missing attorney still lingered in her mind. Reyes had never officially investigated the case, but something about it felt unfinished. One afternoon, while reviewing old FBI case reports tied to legal system breaches, she came across a strikingly familiar situation. A defense attorney named Gerald Pierce had vanished from a small Ohio town under eerily similar circumstances, car abandoned near a trail. No sign of a struggle, and a case quietly closed due to lack of evidence. Curious, she dug deeper. Another report surfaced, this time from rural Illinois. A young public defender named Dana Cho had disappeared after representing clients in police misconduct lawsuits. Her disappearance was ruled voluntary by local authorities, citing job stress and family issues. Though her family vehemently denied any such claims, patterns began to emerge. All 3 attorneys had challenged law enforcement policies. All had made enemies in courtrooms and sheriff departments. All had cases that threatened to bring policy reforms. And in every case, the investigation seemed conveniently closed. lacking transparency and urgency. Reyes began building a timeline, tracing each missing attorney and comparing their legal records. She compiled court motions, public hearings, and local news reports, seeking any shred of connection. What she found was a web of disappearances that spanned multiple states, hidden in plain sight. Each victim had a history of legal advocacy that unsettled the very systems they operated within. All had faced pushback, threats, or quiet warnings in the months before vanishing. Reyes tried to escalate her findings, but without definitive evidence or jurisdiction, there was little her office could do. These weren't federal cases yet. A breakthrough came when she uncovered a news article buried deep online, dated just weeks before Peter Langford's disappearance. It detailed a tense public hearing where Langford had argued that Hollow Creek's local surveillance ordinance violated state law. According to minutes from the meeting, several high-ranking law enforcement officials had opposed him aggressively. One of them was Sheriff Dale Monroe, a name that appeared again in Gerald Pierce's case as a visiting guest speaker in Ohio at the time. Reyes was beginning to suspect that these weren't isolated incidents. She began filing Freedom of Information Act requests, trying to access internal communications and case files from departments tied to the missing attorneys. Responses were slow, many arriving with heavy redactions. Still, her suspicion grew. Someone, or a group of people, had motive, they had means, and they had a reason to make these attorneys disappear without leaving a trace. The more Reyes uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became. A pattern of silence stretched across counties, with local departments showing a worrying reluctance to cooperate or even acknowledge the disappearances. Reyes realized she was up against something more organized than she had imagined. Not a single serial killer or lone predator, but perhaps a hidden alliance operating under the shield of the law itself. Weeks passed as Reyes quietly continued her investigation, compiling every lead, no matter how small. It was a case she couldn't officially pursue, but that didn't stop her from searching. She kept her research hidden, even from colleagues, knowing that suspicion could jeopardize everything. Then, without warning, an unmarked envelope arrived at her personal mailbox. There was no return address, no message, just a plain flash drive inside, labeled with a strip of red tape that read, Clayton County, 2020. Reyes plugged it into a secure laptop and opened the contents. The footage was grainy and taken from a high angle, possibly a security camera mounted on a light pole or building. The timestamp had been digitally erased. In the video, a man who closely resembled Sheriff Dale Monroe could be seen loading a large duffel bag into the trunk of an unmarked black police vehicle in a poorly lit alley. The footage cut out before the vehicle left the scene, but the implication was clear. Reyes had no way to authenticate the video's origin or prove it hadn't been doctored, but it was enough to reignite the Hollow Creek case under federal interest. She discreetly reopened her file on Langford and expanded it to include the Ohio and Illinois cases. Quietly, Reyes began tracking Sheriff Monroe's movements and history. Officially, he had been praised for reducing crime and boosting public trust in law enforcement. Unofficially, his department had one of the highest internal case closure rates in the state. 100 resolution, all marked as either lack of evidence or resolved without charges. Several officers who had filed complaints during Monroe's tenure had either resigned abruptly or transferred. Their exit paperwork contained no red flags, but when Reyes contacted one former officer off the record, she got silence followed by a disconnected number. Piecing together a timeline, she discovered Monroe had traveled to every county where one of the attorneys had disappeared. In most cases, his visits were listed as professional networking or public safety coordination. It was the perfect cover. No one would question a sheriff attending regional meetings or conferences. But in each location, he had always stayed 1 or 2 days longer than the event required. Reyes believed those extra days weren't coincidence. She tracked down an old private investigator hired by Peter Langford's wife shortly after his disappearance. He had kept his own quiet files, unwilling to get involved too deeply, but still haunted by what he'd found. He handed over a set of notes, records of license plates, patterns of late-night meetings near local courthouses, and photos of Monroe in places he shouldn't have been. It was circumstantial, but it gave Reyes enough to approach a federal prosecutor. Together, they began building a case for a sting operation. But Reyes knew it wouldn't be enough to indict Monroe alone. If he was part of a larger network, exposing him would only cause the others to go deeper underground. She needed to bait them into making a mistake, something that would rip the cover off the operation and reveal what had been hiding in plain sight for years. Reyes knew that gathering evidence wasn't enough. She needed to draw the network out, to force them into action. With help from the federal prosecutor's office, she devised an undercover operation designed to mirror the cases that had triggered the disappearances. The bait would be Rachel Vega, a seasoned legal aid attorney known for her outspokenness against police misconduct. Vega agreed to pose as a new legal reformer in a small southern town notorious for its outdated criminal justice system. Her role was to challenge policies, reopen buried abuse cases, and quietly make waves that couldn't go unnoticed. The plan was meticulous. Vega would operate under a fabricated identity, equipped with hidden cameras, encrypted communication channels, and federal protection. Every meeting she took, every case she filed, was documented and monitored. Within weeks of her arrival, the subtle signs began. Her legal motions were mysteriously delayed. Some files went missing from her office, and her car alarm was triggered multiple times late at night. A neighbor noticed an unmarked SUV parked near her apartment on 3 different nights. Reyes and her team watched closely, waiting for the escalation. One night, just after 2 a.m., a man disguised as a maintenance worker attempted to access Vega's apartment. He was intercepted by federal agents and taken into custody. During questioning, the man revealed he had been hired by a private security consultant through a burner phone, instructed to collect materials from Vega's apartment and observe without engaging. His payment had come through an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet. Digging into the phone records, Reyes found encrypted messages containing addresses, photographs, and details about Vega's movements. A digital forensics team traced the source to a shell company linked to a security firm based in Missouri, a firm with quiet contracts to law enforcement groups across multiple states. The same company had provided consulting services in Clayton County during the year Peter Langford disappeared. This discovery cracked the case wide open. Reyes secured warrants to raid several locations tied to the firm. What they found exceeded even her expectations. There were hard drives with surveillance data on over 30 attorneys, complete with home addresses, family connections, and court schedules. Dozens of encrypted messages discussed containment actions, a vague term that agents would later interpret as coded language for intimidation or worse. One document, chillingly titled Directive 77, outlined a protocol for identifying and neutralizing legal threats that disrupted internal order. It was drafted in professional language, but held the tone of covert strategy. Multiple arrests followed, including 3 senior consultants and a retired officer who had coordinated logistics, but Sheriff Monroe was nowhere to be found. His last known location was a cabin near the Canadian border, where agents discovered surveillance equipment and burner phones. Monroe was on the run, and now Reyes had the proof to connect him directly to the disappearances. With the network exposed and the system cracked open, the race to capture its architect had begun. The silence that had once protected them was shattered. Sheriff Dale Monroe was captured 4 days later near a private airstrip in rural Ontario. He was traveling under a false identity, carrying forged documents and a briefcase filled with unmarked cash. His arrest marked the official end of the sting operation, but in many ways, it was just the beginning. As the federal case unfolded, investigators began connecting the dots between Monroe and a broader coalition of high-ranking officials, consultants, and retired law enforcement officers who had conspired for over a decade to suppress legal reform through intimidation, coercion, and in some cases, permanent disappearance. The centerpiece of the investigation became a collection of internal files uncovered during the raid's documents and communications that referenced a covert framework known as Directive 77. Though not officially recognized by any agency, The material suggested the directive had been drafted in the early 2000s under the guise of interagency coordination to maintain systemic balance during periods of policy disruption. It had started as an unofficial strategy quiet monitoring of attorneys and reformers, but over time, it evolved into something far more sinister. Through Monroe's encrypted laptop, Reyes and her team gained access to a centralized server used to track targets across multiple states. Profiles of over 50 individuals were stored there: lawyers, judges, journalists, even advocacy group leaders, each flagged for elevated risk to structural integrity. Many had experienced unexplained threats, surveillance, or harassment. A handful had vanished entirely, like Peter Langford, with Monroe listed as the last point of contact in several of those profiles. The revelation shocked the nation. What began as a missing person case had grown into one of the most damning scandals in modern U.S. law enforcement history. News outlets dubbed it the Shield Conspiracy. Congressional hearings were launched. State after state demanded independent reviews of sheriff departments, union TIs, and policy enforcement boards. In a sweeping series of moves, oversight committees were formed, and dozens of counties implemented mandatory transparency reforms. Civil rights groups pushed for federal oversight of local law enforcement, leading to the passage of the Public Accountability and Legal Protection Act, a bill that required all law enforcement interactions with legal professionals to be documented and reported. For Mia Reyes, the case had been more than professional, it had become personal. Her persistence had dismantled a network that thrived in secrecy. But with that victory came a sobering truth. For every file uncovered, there were likely others that had been deleted or never recorded. Some victims would remain unidentified, their stories buried in silence. In her final press briefing before transferring to a new assignment, Reyes warned that policy abuse doesn't always come in the form of overt brutality. Sometimes, it wears a badge, speaks in legal jargon, and operates in shadows where the law fails to reach. Peter Langford's widow finally received closure. His remains were recovered near a closed construction site linked to Monroe's former deputy. The truth, though painful, gave her something no theory or rumor ever could answer. Hollow Creek would never be the same, but its story helped expose a truth much larger than itself. The centerpiece of the investigation became a collection of internal files uncovered during the raid's documents and communications that referenced a covert framework known as Directive 77. Though not officially recognized by any agency, the material suggested the directive had been drafted in the early 2000s under the guise of interagency coordination to maintain systemic balance during periods of policy disruption. It had started as an unofficial strategy quiet monitoring of attorneys and reformers, but over time, it evolved into something far more sinister. Through Monroe's encrypted laptop, Reyes and her team gained access to a centralized server used to track targets across multiple states. Profiles of over 50 individuals were stored there: lawyers, judges, journalists, even advocacy group leaders, each flagged for elevated risk to structural integrity. Many had experienced unexplained threats, surveillance, or harassment. A handful had vanished entirely, like Peter Langford, with Monroe listed as the last point of contact in several of those profiles. The revelation shocked the nation. What began as a missing person case had grown into one of the most damning scandals in modern U.S. law enforcement history. News outlets dubbed it the Shield Conspiracy. Congressional hearings were launched. State after state demanded independent reviews of sheriff departments, union TIs, and policy enforcement boards. In a sweeping series of moves, oversight committees were formed, and dozens of counties implemented mandatory transparency reforms. Civil rights groups pushed for federal oversight of local law enforcement, leading to the passage of the Public Accountability and Legal Protection Act, a bill that required all law enforcement interactions with legal professionals to be documented and reported. For Mia Reyes, the case had been more than professional, it had become personal. Her persistence had dismantled a network that thrived in secrecy. But with that victory came a sobering truth. For every file uncovered, there were likely others that had been deleted or never recorded. Some victims would remain unidentified, their stories buried in silence. In her final press briefing before transferring to a new assignment, Reyes warned that policy abuse doesn't always come in the form of overt brutality. Sometimes, it wears a badge, speaks in legal jargon, and operates in shadows where the law fails to reach. Peter Langford's widow finally received closure. His remains were recovered near a closed construction site linked to Monroe's former deputy. The truth, though painful, gave her something no theory or rumor ever could answer. Hollow Creek would never be the same, but its story helped expose a truth much larger than itself.